The trip started as an idea of being able to firstly see Canada and take a look at places and see places from a perspective that you can only do from the air. But I was originally inspired because my dad, who's been a lifelong pilot, he would fly air rallies in Europe. So I always looked for that kind of an opportunity where you can combine flying with an adventure and with the opportunity to meet people that have similar interests. The planning that goes into this, fortunately, the International Air Rally Group, they really put it all together, and they've been doing that for a long time. So that gave me a lot of comfort, because going over those vast distances, availability of fuel, availability of places to land, these all factor into where you end up. So the fact that they had planned all this was already helpful, but that was just the start of the whole journey. Andy landed the day before and had virtually no time to adjust, but he was ready to go. It was just one of those picture-perfect mornings, to be honest. We ended up taking off first thing. We ended up flying about 3 hours, and that whole Gore Bay, Manitoulin Island area and north from there, it's just incredible to see. We decided to fly up to Chapleau, gassing up, and we didn't waste any time because, again, we wanted to get as far as we could in day one. And we take off. We now fly along the northern shore of Lake Superior, which is another beautiful, wild, rugged place. It's just borealis forest with rolling hills and rocks. And as we fly west, we're watching the weather. We made a decision to fly to Sioux Lookout. And Sioux Lookout is a very busy airport. We were the smallest airplane at the airport. We ended up taking off and we got into Kenora. We had a friend that lives in Kenora, so we ended up going for breakfast with them. They gave us a quick tour, and then we ended up pushing off. We were starting to get into the forest fire smoke. We knew it was going to come along the way, and we were going to have to deal with it. There's an interesting optical illusion that at least happened to us, where you fly and you keep thinking, like, you can see the curvature of the smoke the further out you look. We figured as we were getting closer to where it was coming from that it would be at a lower altitude. And the thing was, it never did. And at no point were we ever in a challenging situation, but certainly we were navigating through a lot of this haze and a lot of this material in the air. But we could see after we landed in Yorkton that we had a very fine film of dark ash on the leading edges of the wing, on the prop, on the aircraft. We ended up changing the air filter. We did some math and we saw that we could make it to Lloydminster. So we push off, and what I'm noticing is the further west we go, there's a lot more wind. Either I had a headwind, a tailwind, a crosswind, there was always a wind somewhere. It's getting later in the day. We ended up fueling up right away, and we checked the radar, and there was a front coming through. We ended up tying the plane down. Storm came through. The wind was just incredible. 80, 90 kilometer an hour wind across the runway, and we were stuck there for 2 days. We were only an hour's flight from Edmonton, but we certainly had to plan and be ready for Edmonton because it's an international airport. We were between the airliners, so we had to keep our minimum speed as high as possible so they wouldn't affect all the planes behind us. We flew halfway down the runway and we touched down right before the taxiway, and then we pulled off as fast as we could. And then air traffic control said, "Good job, guys." From there, we ended up taxiing and we went to where all of the air rally aircraft were staging. And that really was the start of the overall rally. We had our pilot briefing. It was the first time we got to meet the organizers. It was really great to meet a lot of the people that were along, and there wasn't a whole lot of ice to break. So because we were in the slowest third with our 180, we were the second aircraft to take off. We ended up taking off from Edmonton in the morning, and our flight plan took us to Fort Smith. It was another one of those beautiful mornings where the sun was coming up, and we flew right over downtown Edmonton. And I have friends in Edmonton, so we ended up sending them some pictures of us. We said, "By the way, we're in town. Now we're not." And here's a quick pic of us flying over the city, which was cool. You could tell that we're getting into that northern, called subarctic terrain. We flew at around 3,000, 3,500 feet, depending on where we were along this route, because we wanted to see things. And obviously we were cautious around altitudes and finding places to land if we ever had an emergency. But many of the other aircraft behind us, they flew at higher altitudes. As we get to Fort Smith, it was really windy there. We probably landed in about 200 feet. We refuel, lots of activity there, took a break. So we ended up taking off. Andy and I fly over a large lake. Out in the middle of this lake is this lush green island, and there were animals running around. And what it was wood bison. That was our first opportunity to see wildlife that we normally wouldn't see. So then we fly on and we get to Great Slave Lake. It's just impressive to see. While we fly over, my brother, he looks out the window and he sees a golf course below. And that golf course was all sand. The only thing that was green was the actual greens. As we get to Yellowknife, the cool part was that the first plane we saw once we landed was a Buffalo Airways Electra. This was part of that TV show, Ice Pilots Northwest Territories. We had a tour of the Buffalo Airways hangar, which was arranged. So we got to see the whole operation, all of the aircraft that they had, at least that were on the ground. And we ended up seeing some of the personalities that were on the show. And we actually saw Joe McBrien, who was the owner and the patriarch of the family. So we saw him and his dog. So that was pretty neat. So we knew we were in the right place for Northern Aviation. The next day we ended up doing a tour of the harbor. And so the funny thing was it's a houseboat tour, and I was like, oh, maybe we're gonna go on a houseboat to tour around. And the reality was that we had a tour of the harbor, and in there are barges with houses on them. And some of them were quite modern and quite nicely put together, and then some of them were much simpler. But the unique thing is that they don't pay any property taxes because they're floating, which I found quite crafty. We ended up going to the Bush Plane Memorial, which was neat to see. And then the next day was a continuation of the trip. We ended up taking off first thing in the morning. We ended up flying to Plummer's Lodge, which was a neat opportunity. My brother and I decided to fly along the Great Slave Lake shoreline. The scenery we saw was just dramatic. We ended up getting to Plummer's Lodge, and they had a very large runway there, a gravel strip. So we ended up landing there. We were greeted by all of the staff that was there to help us with all of our bags, and the rest of the group also was able to get all their stuff to the lodge. And first thing we said was, how can we start fishing right away? And off we went. They have, I believe, 4 world records for trout. We were catching 10-pound, 15-pound lake trout, and they kept telling us those are not trophies. You know, those are nice fish, but let's get you guys some big fish. And so we ended up fishing a lot, and we enjoyed every minute of it. And I think the guy did too, because he was out with 2 guys that really wanted to spend as much time on the water as possible. And even after we got back, after catching a lot of fish, we ended up fishing off the shoreline, and we were catching more fish. And the unique thing about where the Plummer's Lodge is located is that it has a current. So there's no river there, but the current is because of wind on the lake. And that's just enough activity to create a flow. A lot of the other members of the group, they were fishing from boat as well as from shore, and they were catching all sorts of fish, including grayling and lake trout and whatnot. So it was great kickoff to the first day there. Next day, my brother and I had breakfast. Out we went. Fished all day and again in the evening. Then we're already thinking about where we're going next. So a lot of the group were going to leave from Plumbers and head to Stony Rapids in Saskatchewan because they had fuel along the way. But my brother and I, we'd already put 2 of our 5-gallon fuel bladders. We emptied the 2 of those into the tanks. We made a decision to fly back to Fort Smith. So we actually flew west and south instead of east, heading towards Churchill. Refuel there, and then we head east, and then we flew to Stony Rapids. Interestingly, from Fort Smith to Stony Rapids, I was surprised by some of the mountainous terrain that exists in Northwest Territories close to the Saskatchewan border. So we got to Stony Rapids, and then the big thing was make the decision either fly to Churchill directly or fly to Thompson, refuel, and then go to Churchill. The challenge was that Churchill also had no fuel. So we weren't going to have enough fuel to get to Rankin if we had flown directly to Churchill. So we fly, take off, and we flight plan to go to Thompson. Well, halfway there, we're getting into all sorts of forest fire activity, and we're seeing islands and lakes and brush that's actively on fire. And there's no firefighters there, and we were a little worried because we were thinking about restricted airspace and having water bombers and helicopters and such activity affecting us or us affecting them. Well, halfway to Thompson, all of a sudden on our screen, on our GPS, there's a active restricted zone that pops up, which was not there before. And we tried to fly around this. And I tried calling Winnipeg Center and to Edmonton Flight Service. I could hear them, they couldn't hear me. But there was an aircraft behind us that was part of our group, and I ended up connecting with them. My brother and I were thinking, what's the right thing to do? So we ended up trying to fly around this box. And as we are about to get around, and the whole box shifts again in our path. So finally, just to avoid any kind of concerns, why don't we deviate? We'll fly up to a place called Lynn Lake. And it shows they've got a full service runway there, they've got fuel, and that sets us up better if we're still trying to get to Churchill that day, because now we're getting into midday. We pull off, I see fuel tanks, that's a good sign. The terminal looked like it hadn't seen a lot of activity, so I was worried. So I go into the terminal, the door opens, but no one was there. I'm looking around and I see a piece of paper on the counter, and it says, if you need anything, call this number. So I call the number, and the person picks up. This gentleman was barbecuing at home. So we refuel, got in the air, it was full of lakes, and the sun was going down behind us, and it looked like a landscape on another planet. At this point, we knew that we had to boogie. I flew as fast as we could in the aircraft, so it's getting darker. Fortunately, we saw the runway from a long ways out. And as we get closer to the airport, the wind is coming straight down the runway, which is good. As we're landing, it seemingly took like twice the time it would normally take because the wind was so strong. It was almost in slow motion, like as though you're landing a helicopter. Get the airplane down, and we see that all the other planes had arrived. Then we get to the hotel, and we were way past the restaurant's time being open, so we ended up asking if they had anything. They said, well, all we have is cake. Our dinner was cake from the Lazy Bear Cafe. It was probably the most experimental dining experience we had in the whole trip. The next day, we got to see everybody, shared stories about how the day went prior, because from Yellowknife to Churchill, that's a very long stretch. So we go out on these tundra buggies through the hotel. They have this business of giving guided tours, and we saw our first polar bears. I was just amazed how big they are. Like, just the overall presence in that landscape, like it is just something impressive. Ended up going into some very great restaurants, which I found just surprising and thought was awesome, considering where we were. And then we ended up, the next day was the flight up to Rankin Inlet. So once again, Andy and I, we filled our tanks up with our reserves and our fuel bladders, and then we took off. And that trip was just incredible. We took off from Churchill, and we flew along the coastline all the way up to Rankin Inlet. We were flying anywhere from 300 feet up to 3,000 feet, depending on what we saw. And we saw everything from abandoned boats to over 20 polar bears from what we could see just from flying by. We come in for landing, and we were fortunate to meet some of the locals that knew that we were arriving. They're not used to seeing private aircraft like this come into this airport, because the airport's usually servicing northern communities, cargo, industry, etc. So all the fuel was in barrels, from plane to plane, tank to tank, and barrel to barrel. This took hours. Interestingly, on the way up, we saw polar bears, but no beluga whales. And I think it's because if we looked right, we were looking into the sun. On the way home, we couldn't see any polar bears on the shoreline, but we saw hundreds, if not 1,000 plus beluga whales. It was just amazing. I could not believe it. Like, the tidal flats were huge. So we'd fly over and we'd see that the water and the shoreline, there was probably 1.5 kilometers, 2 kilometers difference. The tide was coming back in, and we saw these amazing currents of the tide going over whatever features were there on the shoreline. So we get back to Churchill. We ended up having a group dinner at the hotel, which was fantastic. And we just honestly said that this was just such a great experience for us, just such an overwhelming, wonderful opportunity to see the country. We were hopeful to see Northern Lights. As we get closer to 11, someone posts on the WhatsApp channel that there's Northern Lights. And then my brother goes and checks them out. And then he comes back to the hotel room and he's like, Mike, you gotta come out and see this. At that point, I look up in the sky and it's this band, this incredible band of lights that goes from one end of the horizon to the other. And it kept intensifying. Eventually it turned into this swirl that almost looks like it's out of some kind of a movie. I couldn't believe what I saw. So now we're out there and there's a curfew in town, which is you can't be outside of a dwelling after 10 p.m. because of the polar bears. So we're standing outside on the deck of the hotel, and we think we're being outlaws. So my brother and I got a great picture of both of us, and a lot of the others that were still awake, they took pictures. And one couple that was along on the trip, the man, he ended up proposing to her, which I thought that was just excellent timing. So everybody was happy for them, and we were able to just enjoy this incredible scenery. So on the flight home from Churchill to a place called Gillam, Manitoba, we're in pursuit of gas. We landed there, and again, going to the terminal, and we couldn't find anybody. Fortunately, one person from our group was able to connect with the airport manager, and they were able to come and gas up all our planes. I go outside, and I hear thunder. So Andy and I don't waste any time, get in the plane, we're the first to take off. And we deviated more easterly, and then we flew around this. And so all the planes behind us, they were able to squeak out in front of this thing, and then we were off heading to Red Lake. So as we get closer, things start starting to look a little more common, or what we're used to seeing. So anyways, we take off, and we're now flying from Red Lake in northwestern Ontario straight to Wawa. Again, amazing terrain, over Lake Nipigon, huge body of water, but the air is still saturated with forest fire smoke. And the forest fire smoke had settled into two layers. So at around 7,500 feet, 100 feet to 200 feet below was one layer of smoke, and then 100 feet to 200 feet above 7,500 feet was another layer. And we flew right between this layer, and I'd never seen that before. And then finally we get to Wawa, we refueled. We had some very fine cuisine at Subway, called it a day. And then we ended up taking off, and we flew over Manitoulin Island, Bruce Peninsula, and then on our way home. We flew about 55 hours in 12 days. So that was a lot of flying in a very short period, at least for us. My brother and I, we don't see each other that often, and this was just a great way for us to catch up and really get that feeling back of what it is to be brothers. And fortunately, both of our families were supportive of this. Because he's a pilot and I'm a pilot, the flying part was a lot of fun. For us, it was truly an adventure in a true sense, and hopefully we do it again.